So my name is James Urquhart. Some of you may know me from the blogging as he talked about. Right now I'm with a company called Sosta, where I am focusing actually on analytics. It's a big career change for me. It's very different from the distributed application development and coding and systems operations focus that I've had for 20 years, close to it. But I want to talk to you why a little bit, but in a kind of a roundabout way. I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the big barriers that we've got kind of left over in the quote-unquote operations space, which affects development, affects IT planning, affects all kinds of stuff. And that's really the conversation that has to begin to happen with the business. And the performance comes into that. I'll talk about it later. But I'm an outcome-focused person. I figured this out only recently when the word outcome-centric started becoming a meme and around design and stuff. So the first outcome I want to get out of the way is my cute animal picture. I love that picture, man. It's going to go in all my presentation. So why is it so hard for established business organizations to align with IT when it comes to digital business opportunities? That's kind of this is the thorn for a long time in people's sides. And there's a million reasons for it. But one of the key reasons that I want to talk about is just one of communication. And the inability to have very strong communication because of language, because of focus, because of the definition of the word outcome in some ways. So we've kind of evolved into this world where, till recently, where the business is very much focused on what business has been focused on for a very, very long time, but trying to add the website into that conversation. So, how do we make profit from mobile? How do we get people to buy stuff when they come to our website? What's this costing me? Very, very simple traditional questions and very important questions. The technology conversation, on the other hand, has come from basically the basis of IT's infrastructure centricity for a long time. So the story I always tell people is very straightforward. IT started out making sure there were computers to run software on, including some software early when it was all custom. But the key thing that IT departments evolved to do was to make sure that the infrastructure and the core software components were there that were needed for the business to get the technology applied to what they were doing. It started out with databases and everything. But what has happened with cloud computing is a shift in mentality to a much more application or solution-centric model of management. So we're moving from this world where we measure everything in terms of, oh man, what's that hardware going to cost me? What's it take to operate it? What's my CPU utilization? Is that efficient? What's my memory utilization? What's my bandwidth? Those questions are beginning to shift around and be a little bit more applied in a similar way to just applications in terms of talking about now about, okay, what's the scale capability of my application? How do I handle users in a certain way? Am I doing this as efficiently as possible? Am I using too many virtual machines or containers? Am I not using enough? What architectures are going to help me optimize? But we're still very focused on the technology in that conversation. And what you end up with is not a conversation between the two organizations. What you end up with is a translation that has to happen between two different elements. And, we don't quite yet have the technology, getting close, but we don't quite have the technology where I can talk in one language and you can talk in another and we can have a real-time conversation at a normal pace. And that's really a big problem and a big thing that's happening, but if you begin to observe what's going on here, you can begin to see that this is a gap that can be filled. And let me explain this a little bit to you. So first, and forgive me, folks, because this is the first time I've done this material at all. I'm looking for feedback later on it, absolutely. But this is, I think, a really important concept for beginning to understand how, as we work in IT, how can we begin to measure things in a way the business consume it easily. So, You've got the business conversation with the metrics that the business cares about. There's some examples of that up there. That's not a complete list at all. You've got the technology conversation at the bottom. You begin to look at what's the value of these metrics and these measurements to each. And this is just beginning to focus down on one piece of the puzzle around the ways we can measure success. So the business values, increasingly the things that get into the business conversation, and the engineering organization cares a lot more about the stuff that gets into technology. There's one other element on the engineering conversation, by the way, which I think is very important, which is not reflected in the slide, which is the engineering organization also wants to know how to prioritize work. So they want to use metrics to be very smart about where they apply resources, right? So a big part of what they're going to care about is more and more of the stuff that helps them identify where they can have the most value and make the most bang for the buck is going to be important. That feedback loop right there of what should I work on next has been largely driven by the metrics in the blue box at the bottom, not by the metrics at the top. So key to the conversation, as I said, I'm very outcome oriented. This is becoming a wonderful thing because I can finally put a word to the way that I've been thinking about things, right? We're becoming very oriented to, so are we getting what we want from the software? And developing processes and approaches to software development, approaches to software design that begin to let us very quickly experiment and find where we're not doing what we want, getting the outcomes we want, and making changes to address those outcomes. What's key here is to understand, if you look at digital systems, if you look at web applications, mobile applications targeted at being the interface to the business for an end user, for those systems, it is the end user's outcomes that drive all the other outcomes. Every other expectation out there. If the user's not happy, they won't buy, right? If the user's not entertained, they won't stay and read or watch another video or whatever your outcome is that you care about. They won't do it. I always point out healthcare is a good example, right? So if the user's not convinced that they found a good solution to whatever their health problem is, they won't make an appointment. They won't, they won't take advantage of the services that you're offering that you charge for. And when you look at that then, oh, by the way, so if you keep this in mind, right? You can't just automate the heck out of this and say, okay, we've got a system up here that people can buy things and we've got the problem taken care of, because you'll get into some situations where the conversation's not very clear. Right? I love that one too. Okay. So then it comes about feedback, and where is that feedback possible if we've got that huge gap in the middle? And it comes down to those metrics that tell us about the user's outcomes. Now we've got a limited set to start with, right? I haven't been focused on this space for very long, but I got to say, these metrics aren't super exciting and sexy, and they're page views, they're navigation paths that result in the best conversion rate itself, right? Which is, of all the people that come to the website, how many actually trigger the desired outcome that you want. Speed to outcome becomes a very interesting metric, right? So if I make the site a little faster, what does that do to the outcome that I care about? Do I increase that or do I decrease it? Same thing with page flow, which I just talked about. And you've got other measurements about the user abandoned a session. Why did they abandon a session? It's not always a bad reason, right? Anybody who buys anything relatively large online knows that it usually takes you 3, 4, or 5 sessions of research, even at the site you end up buying at, before you make a decision to buy. It's more important to begin to understand that, not only that there was abandonment, but why, and what patterns are in the data that might show you that. You can do some things that are directly interfacing with the user as well to get metrics that are important in the space. Net Promoter Score, big trend right now. How likely is somebody to recommend your site or your mobile application to somebody else? Huge, huge stat in the media business right now, increasingly important in e-commerce. That's a great stat. Limited scope, but it's a great stat to get an idea of customer sentiment. Better stat than saying, were you happy or were you not happy, 1 to 10, in fact, right? So, and then there's affinity related activities, things like, people who bought this also bought da-da-da, or people who bought this first came back 3 months later and bought this other thing. The famous Target story, do you guys all know the story about probably everybody does at this point, about the young lady who was outed to her father as being pregnant because they found a pattern in the data that says if somebody starts buying these things, then they're probably going to be needing baby clothes and other things in the very near future. And so she started getting mailings at home from Target saying, hey, congratulations, sign up for your baby registry at Target. And by the way, the father was angry. He was like, well, how dare you say that? And then he found out later, no, you guys were right. So all of these things become a conversation about the user. It's not necessarily a conversation with the user, though it can be, but it's going to be I think the better conversations are relatively implicit conversations with the user, where you let the user's activity and interaction with the system speak a lot about their happiness and their unhappiness with what happens. So if you think about this in terms of an internal system, where maybe it's a ERP system or a CRM system or a collaboration system, right? If you can begin to measure and understand the user behavior in that environment, you begin to get a really solid sense of what it takes to be very strong and make your systems better and improved. So this is the holy grail, in my opinion, for digital success, is to begin to understand your user and have that conversation with the business and how the user is interacting with the system. Have that conversation with the user, because that will drive two things. So one is we've already shown that we can actually do a very solid job of doing analytics to determine what your priorities should be as IT in terms of what to work on with the system and the application as a result of this information. And also from the business's perspective, they can get understanding also of whether their view of the digital business and what the digital business is doing is successful from a business perspective. Not just financially, but in terms of, do we have the right business model? Do we have the right products? Those kinds of questions. So here, I'm running out of time a little bit, but here, let me just very quickly kind of go through some of the things that I think are really important to look at, asking the questions that you should get answered on behalf of the user for a digital system talking to a user. So the first is, do you know what your outcome is, your desired outcome is? For a lot of e-commerce businesses, they've been doing this forever, so they know their outcomes. They know what conversion rate means to them. Is it a revenue metric? Is it a lead metric? There's a number of things, but that's really important to know, because that's a variable in every other question that I think that you should be asking. And then really, for most digital systems, it breaks down to three things. It breaks down to, what does performance do? And I've got some slides I'll flip to really quick that can kind of blow your mind by what performance can do to your outcomes. But also, how does flow affect it? Is my navigation good? Should I go to a single page application? You can actually begin to answer that question. Is it worth that investment? Probably. How does content affect the user? So do I have the right products? Do I have the right blog posts or social media content? Does my marketing site have useful information that users are using to generate leads? Is our social media program effective in drawing people in to what we're doing? All of those questions that are very important. Now this may seem like, sort of marketing 101 kind of stuff, and there's a certain aspect of this, but what blows me away is how few organizations actually set this up so it's a conversation, ongoing real-time conversation between IT and business, right? They hand the report off once a week. That's not the conversation I'm talking about. To have a page that they can go to, a dashboard that they can go to, or to even have a commentary that comes out once a morning that says, hey, this is what increased and decreased compared to yesterday, compared to a quarter ago, those kinds of things. That is the level of information that people can do. And really, in this day and age, if you don't have some capability to drill down into the analytics, whether it's through something like R or Julia or one of the other analytics languages, but people who know how to use that, or just even some of the new analytics apps that let you drill down a little bit more point and click, which have strengths and weaknesses. Those are really important. So real quick, so some ideas in terms of what the numbers look like when you look at performance. This is why I think it's important to have this conversation, and to have this conversation based on actually measuring what's going on out there. Because in reality, right, the business may not understand that if I work on speed on this page, it's going to drive X amount of dollars potentially. That's what our predictive models say. Basically Amazon said, if we could increase 100 milliseconds load on our homepage, it actually has about 1% effect on overall sales. That's 680 million, right? Google and Walmart have all published numbers as well that are pretty impressive. We've seen our own with customers where we've had, Lowe's figured out if they cut, I think it was like a second and a quarter or something like that out of a page load time. They did that, and it was measured that following year from that release as $80 million in additional revenue that they could actually track back to that navigation. So these are real numbers, and these are real effects on the overall environment, and you begin to get an understanding, I think, in addition to other conversations that have to happen between the business and IT, ones that happen already around features, around personas and target market stuff, you begin to have an understanding that this performance part of this conversation is a bridge. It's a bridge between the way that the old IT has worked and the way the new relationship between the IT and business can be. So I hope that was helpful and useful, but I'm a big believer that what cloud is enabling is, we're seeing it in development already with DevOps. We're seeing the breaking down of traditional silos and barriers. And I think one of the major ones that still have to be broken down, that isn't broken down very well, is this sort of throw it over the wall, especially in older organizations where they haven't built up around digital business, this throw it over the wall kind of conversation that we've been having. Thank you.